reason there's not a pill like that. But tonight what we're going to look at is how to responding, and not, maybe not give you a complete understanding of this, but in some ways understanding about responding to the unfaithfulness of others. So being faithful when others are unfaithful. Other believers, the world, family, friends, whatever it may be, the unfaithfulness of others. So we're in John 18. I'm going to start reading in verse 1. I'm going to read down to verse 11. I'm going to just invite you to follow along as I read out loud. John 18, I'll begin reading in verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Cedron, where was a garden, into the which he entered and his disciples. And Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus oft times resorted thither with his disciples. Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus saith unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. And as soon then as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these, talking about the fellow disciples, let these go their way, that the same saying might be fulfilled, which he spake, Of them which thou gavest me have I lost none. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Now, I don't think he was aiming at the ear. I think he was aiming at something else, and the guy kind of ducked and went and chopped off his ear. That's how I envision it. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into thy sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? So we're going to talk about this idea about being faithful when others are unfaithful. That what surprises me as I read chapter 18 is the difference in Jesus' action compared to everyone else. He is very determined, very purposeful, very faithful in what he's doing. Jesus is true and faithful as always, and these others here are fearful and deceptive. Now I want you to consider this with me. When Jesus went in the Garden of Gethsemane and he was arrested, it wasn't like, it wasn't that. He knew going into it what was going to happen. It's not a surprise to him. He knew what was going to happen, and he went into this situation even though knowing it. So he was not surprised. He was not caught unaware. Rather, he went there on purpose, knowing what awaited him. Go back to verse 2. And Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place. Now, if you know Judas is betraying you, and you know Judas knows where you're going, and you go there, you know what's about to happen. And Jesus goes there knowing this. Now, this is not recklessness on his part. This is faithfulness on his part, obedience on his part, faithful obedience. Look at chapter 18, look at verse 11. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into thy sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? This is the right thing to happen. I know what's happening. I'm doing it because this is God's will here. Go back to John 13, if you will. John 13. Look with me in verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God, and went to God. So this is a very knowledgeable thing that God is doing. Now, the reason I'm pointing that out, number one, is because he is faithful. Number two is I want you to notice he did what was right, even though he knew it would cost him his life. Now, somehow, this is like, if you had asked me when I was 18, I would say, oh, yeah, I'm just getting into adulthood, but I'm sure everyone figures this out. If you'd asked me from 18 to about 55, I would have said, everyone understands who's a believer. It doesn't matter if it costs you your life, you do what's right. Can I tell you, I don't think that's true anymore. I think most people think that they can walk away from God in order to protect their life. There's something happened recently that makes me think that. I'll leave it up to you to figure that out. Now, it's proper to take precautions. so as not to carelessly endanger your life. Okay, if you are at nighttime riding a bike, I would have a light on the bike. Okay, it's dark. They're not going to see you. They're going to hit you. I know that because for 3 years I rode my 10-speed bike at night. And I'm telling you, I had to swerve a lot of times. I should have had a light. I know. There's a lot of things I should have done in life. But I tell you, it's dangerous out there. So there are certain things, precautions you can take. You should take care of your health if you can. Eat decent food. Get some exercise. There's a lot of things we can do just being wise and good stewards with the health God has given us, the life God has given us. All that is true. Take normal, reasonable precautions. Do not carelessly endanger your life. But we should never operate in fear. If I'm doing something in fear, I'm almost guaranteed I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing. Because God has not given us that spirit of fear. It's not from the Lord. So we should never operate in fear, nor should we ever compromise our faith to preserve our life. You know, back in college days, there's always like the big question, well, what if someone puts your gun to your head and says, will you deny Christ? Would you do it? Oh, no, I would never do it. What if someone puts your gun to your head and says, you don't believe the Bible? Oh, no, I would never do it. So our mind is, I would never risk my life to compromise. But in reality, I think that's not always true for us. It is wrong to respond in fear and trust your own actions just to preserve your life. So what Jesus is doing, he's doing it in faithfulness, he's doing it in faith, he's doing it in obedience. He's being faithful. Now it's also important to note that what Jesus is doing, he did this knowing the actions of those in this chapter. Nothing that happened from this point going forward was a surprise. When Judas betrayed him, he wasn't like, oh no, Judas, you're betraying me. It wasn't like he knew that. When Peter, in a little bit, is going to say, Jesus? Who's Jesus? I don't know who Jesus is. When he denies him 3 times, that's not a surprise. In fact, remember, Jesus told Peter he would do that. Nothing in this chapter, nothing in these events surprises him. So he knows what's about to happen. He's being faithful in what's happening because this is what God has called all of us to do, is to be faithful. Now, he didn't just give his... Let me back up for a moment. He even knew what the enemies were going to do. He knew what the priests were going to do, and the scribes and the Pharisees. He knew what Pilate was going to do. Now, he's about to give his life. And he's going to give his life for his disciples, even though his disciples are going to forsake him and run away. But you know, he also has given his life for those who showed up to arrest him and those who were going to, the Jewish people who were going to accuse him falsely and send him to Pilate. He was giving his life for Pilate. He was also giving his life for the Roman soldiers who were going to hit him and put the crown of thorns on him and scourge him and spit on him and mock him. Even the ones who are going to drive the nails, because that's what Jesus does. He loves all of us and gave his life for all of us. So he didn't just give his life for his followers, he's given his life for his enemies, and he's not just given his life for those who are faithful, he's given his life for even those who are going to be unfaithful. So in this lesson, what I want us to do, I want us to look, so we talked about Jesus here. Now I want us to take a moment and look at the other people, these other characters here, what's going on with them. And first, as we do that, I want you to see that Jesus knew about them and gave his life for them. All the people we're about to talk about, don't forget, Jesus knew this, and he died for them anyways. The second thing I want us to do as we look at this tonight, I want us to be confronted with Jesus' faithfulness in the midst of a man's unfaithfulness, which should elicit praise. We talk often about salvation, but our salvation is because we had a faithful Savior. In spite of all the unfaithfulness of man, it was always God's plan to come and die for us. It's always been his plan. He's a faithful Savior. And then thirdly, to encourage our own faithfulness when others are not. Now, if you've never been confronted with the unfaithfulness of others, you live for the Lord long enough and you will be. It's going to hurt. Now, it's different if someone comes for 2 weeks and you never see him again. That's not the same. But let me tell you, if you live for the Lord long enough, you're going to find people you looked up to. who are going to disappoint you greatly. It's going to hurt. You're going to people you served with, you went soul winning with, you taught maybe a Sunday school class with, you went to men's activities with or ladies' activities with, and there was a bond there. There was your hearts were knitted, and all of a sudden now it's ripped apart because of their unfaithfulness. And it can be very difficult in your Christian life. So encourage us in our own faithfulness when others are unfaithful. So let's go back now to our text here, chapter 18. I want to share with you 5 different groups that I notice in here that we may experience, and we need to be faithful in spite of these. So look with me at verse number 3. Let's look at the first group together. Verse 3, Judas then, having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things what should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said unto him, I am he. And to me, this is a very sad statement. And Judas also, which betrayeth him, stood with them. Man. So number 1 is this. Here's the first thought we're going to share tonight. There are those who choose to purposely reject Jesus. Now, that's true about lost people, and that's to their own damnation. But there's also true about saved people. And I don't mean they lose their salvation, but they leave the will of God. They just walk away and say, I'm not going to live that way anymore. There are those who choose to purposely reject Jesus. How sad are those words we read there in verse number 5. And Judas also, which betrayeth him. Because we could say this, and Judas also, which walked with him. Judas also, who heard him preach. Judas also, who heard him teach. Judas also, who witnessed the miracles. Judas also, who had meals with him and spent time with him. This same Judas is now betraying him and standing with the ones who are going to arrest him. So this idea of betraying him. Now, I tell you tonight, Judas is not the only one who's ever turned their back on Jesus and walked away. Don't you wish that Judas was the only one who ever did that? And we could say, well, Judas did it, but from that day forward, every other believer has been faithful to Jesus Christ. But that's not been true. In fact, I'm going to tell you this, it's not something, well, in 2023, can I tell you it's always been this way? Because that's the sinful state of man. There's always been those who have walked the straight and narrow and then somehow found a detour or an exit ramp, and now they're doing things that break your heart. Hold your place there in John 18. Go with me to 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy. So my point of showing you this verse is to make sure we understand this is not a new phenomenon. It isn't, in these days. Well, it's true in these days, but it's been true in those days as well. In Paul, the Apostle Paul's journeys, he had men that traveled with him. He trained them. He kind of sent them out as, let's say, emissaries. He sent them out sometimes to go ahead of him. Sometimes he sent them to places he couldn't go. We know Timothy, we know Titus, we know some of the more famous ones, but there was a man named Demas who traveled with them, who ministered with Paul. But notice verse 10 of 2 Timothy chapter 4. For Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed to Thessalonica. Crescens to Galatia, Titus into Dalmatia. Now, we don't think these other two forsook him. They're just other places ministering. But Demas is not there because Demas has forsaken the Apostle Paul. And by doing so, he's walking out of the will of God, walking away from the Lord. So unfortunately, there are believers who walk with us for a while and then walk away. Now watch, and sometimes try to get you to walk away with them. There are people who used to go to churches like this, who won't go to church, who would never come to a church like this, and their ministry now is to try to get other people in churches like this out of churches like this. And you're like, why? Okay, if you got a problem, you got a problem. But why now are you trying to hurt all the other churches? So let me give you a couple of things to write down. It is important that your faithfulness is not based on man's faithfulness, but on God's faithfulness. Now, other believers can play an important role in our Christian growth, and they do. But our eyes must always stay affixed on God, on Jesus Christ. if you've gone soul winning a lot, you have met someone, you've knocked on the door, and you've talked to someone who claims to be saved. They give you a clear testimony of salvation. And you say, well, what church go to? Or they'll say, I got saved such and such church. And usually it's a good soul-winning Baptist type church like ours. And they'll say, I went there and I got saved. And they give you the testimony. And then you say, well, where church you go to now? And they're like, oh, I don't go to church now. And you can't get them to church now. And you're like, well, what happened? And typically what they'll say is, so someone did something, and now I'll never go to church again. The preacher did this. The preacher ran off with the secretary, or the preacher ran off with the piano player, or some deacon did this to some person, or someone made a fuss about this. They'll talk about someone in the church. And the question is always this, so what does that have to do with you? So man disappointed man. That's kind of the history of man. But all that means is this: you are looking at the wrong person, which is my next point here. If man's unfaithfulness causes us to be unfaithful, then our eyes were on man and not on God. Hold your place in John. Go with me to the book of Psalms, Psalms 12. Psalms 12. Pick up in verse 1, just read the whole psalm. Now, in the context, we often use this psalm talking about the preservation of Scripture. And it's true, but it's also dealing with unfaithful people. Look at verse 1. Help, Lord, for the godly man ceaseth, for the faithful fail from among the children of men. They speak vanity, every one with his neighbor, with flattering lips, and with a double heart do they speak. The Lord shall cut off all flattering lips, and the tongue that speaketh proud things. Who have said, with our tongue will we prevail, and our lips are our own. Who is Lord over us? For the oppression of the poor, for the sighing of the needy, now will I arise, saith the Lord. I will set him in safety from him that puffeth at him. The words of the Lord are pure words, a silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever. The wicked walk on every side, when the vilest men are exalted. What's interesting, in the unfaithfulness of men, what does God point us to? Back to the faithfulness of His Word. That's what we got to keep our eyes on. So it is true that man can be unfaithful, but we must keep our eyes on the Lord and not on man, because we need to be faithful in spite of them. Let's go back now to John 18. Let's look at another group. So we saw Judas there. Now let's look at the soldiers for a moment. Verse 3, Judas then having, I'm repeating the verses and going a little bit further. Verse 3, Judas then having received a band of men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus therefore, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said unto him, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with him. As soon as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Isn't that an interesting thing? They're all big and brave. We're going to go get Jesus. So we're going to come out at night so no one sees us. And maybe no one will help them out. And so they're all sneaking out, slinking out at night. And as soon as they confront him, I don't know, they're looking for Judas to point him out. And so as soon as they confront him and they recognize him, they're backing up real fast. Like, whoa, wait a minute. And so then Jesus asking him, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. He says, that's me. I've told you that I am he. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way, that the same might be fulfilled which he spake. Of them which thou gavest me have I lost none. So it brings us to big number 2, the second group. And these are people who just basically, they're unfaithful because they just go with the flow. They're these people. So let me visit them for a moment before I give you the point. Sometimes I wonder why people live the way they live. Is it because that's how other people live, or do you have core principles, core values? You know what's sad? It's sad to see a church like this who preaches a certain way and has a certain belief and certain values, and as soon as leadership changes, everyone just goes along with them. It's like, wait a minute, I thought we all believed this. No. This is what we believed. Which way is the wind blowing? And that's basically what these soldiers are. They're just going to flow. Okay, Judas, you lead us. And as soon as they were confronted with Jesus, now they're backing up. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe we won't arrest you. That brings us to number 2. There are those who refuse to take a stand. Again, this causes us some difficulty because we're trying to be faithful, and you look at other people, they're wimpy, wishy-washy. For example, it is an abomination, it is a sin, it is iniquity, it is wickedness, okay, whatever word you want to use, for a man to marry a man or a woman to marry a woman. It's always been that way. Doesn't matter. Well, back in 20 years ago, everyone was against it. Probably. But now everyone's for it. Doesn't surprise me. But what does that matter? Has God changed his mind about it? No, not a bit. But we don't take a stand. Most of us are comfortable. We're like the soldiers. When everyone's together, okay, we'll get them. All of a sudden, we're confronted. Now we're like, oh, well, wait a minute. Well, maybe I don't want to take this stand because this isn't as popular as I thought it was. So there are those who refuse to take a stand. They were willing to come out at night to arrest Jesus, but they're not willing to stand up when they're confronted by Jesus. They're kind of like group think. That's how the world is. No true, hard, fast principles. They sway in the wind. They conform to the crowd. Really don't have hardcore beliefs. So let me give you something to write. If you're only faithful to your core principles when the crowd agrees with you, then you're neither truly faithful nor have core principles. It just means you're just wimpy and you're just going with the crowd. Hold your place in John 18. Genesis 49. Genesis 49. So let me ask you, as you're turning to Genesis 49, have you ever had to take a stand for the Lord and lose money, lose job, lose friends, lose popularity? If you go your entire Christian life, now, if you just got saved a year ago, that's maybe you haven't got there yet. If you're not an adult yet, maybe you're not there yet. But if you've been saved a decade and more, and you've never had to make a hard choice like that, here's what I think. This is my opinion. This is what I think. You're probably not standing. Because there's plenty of things to stand on the Word of God that brings us into conflict with the world out there. Now, I'm not looking for conflict. Usually. I got to admit, sometimes I do. That is part of my personality. Did I tell you about getting in trouble with TSA on my flight? I didn't tell you about that? Sometimes I just like to say, well, what would happen if? You want to know the story? Yeah. It's probably better than the Bible study. Yeah. I never told you either? I never told you what happened. She knows I got searched. So, leaving Cleveland, they say to me, I'm going to tell you, at least 6 times they told me to make sure there's nothing in your pocket. After the 3rd or 4th time, I began asking myself, what would happen if I have something in my pocket? Now, I don't mean a gun or a knife or something, okay? I'm not crazy, okay? So I had my wallet, I had my phone. Now, after the 6th time, the guy says, absolutely have nothing in your pocket. And I said, okay, I understand what you're telling me. And I went to the thing, where you stand there and, okay, you stand there like this, zoom, zoom, and I could see their eyes, boing. I said, yep, I got a wallet, and I got a phone. Man, they are like really, really not happy with me. Now we're going to have to really search you. So I stood there. I thought, well, now I know what happens. If you have a wallet and your phone, it makes them mad, and they're really going to not be happy with you, and they search you. So I admit, I do have a certain part of my personality that just likes to say, well, what would happen? Okay, but typically, the issues I have is because I want to be standing on principle, not curiosity. I want to be standing on principle, okay? And if you've never had any conflict ever in your Christian life with a sinful world, You got to say, well, wait a minute. If I'm going this way and they're going this way, how can we not have conflict? Maybe not every day, maybe not over everything, but somewhere along the way. You're at Genesis 49, hopefully by now. Look at verse 3. Jacob is giving his blessings upon his sons. Notice what he says about Reuben. Now, when we think about the sons of Jacob, the one we normally think of is Judah. Judah is not his firstborn. Judah is his fourthborn, but he gets most of the recognition. It has to do with what Reuben did and Levi did and Simeon did. Reuben, Simeon, and Levi did. Here's Reuben. Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might, the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity, and the excellency of power. A lot of good things. Notice the next verse. Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel. You have so much talent, so much ability, you're going to do not very good things because you won't take a stand and do what's right. You're unstable. You're like a cork in the water just floating around. Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel, because thou wentest up to thy father's bed, then defilest thou it. He went up to my couch. So there are those who refuse to take a stand. You ever put water in a vessel, a bowl, a cup, whatever? You notice the water always conforms? That's how some people are. They always conform to what's around them. We need to be more like a rock. You put a rock in a bowl, it still looks like a rock. You put it in a bigger bowl, it still looks like a rock. You put it in a smaller bowl, it still looks like a rock. It keeps its form. Number 3, let's look at the third group. Back to John 18. And I have no more TSA. After that, I obeyed the TSA exactly as I should, because I already found out what would happen, and that wasn't very much fun, really. Try it. Number 3, back to John 18, verse 15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. And I'll just tell you up front, we don't know who that is. That disciple was known unto the high priest and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known as the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then said the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He said, I am not. And the servants and officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Drop down to verse 25. And Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, said, did not I see thee in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. So that brings us to a third unfaithful group. There are those who are fearful when they need to be strong, and that fearfulness causes them to be unfaithful. So what do you do when people are being fearful and unfaithful? Now here's what's strange about Peter's response. There was no need to be fearful. Those who questioned him had no authority, nor were they threatening to turn him in. They weren't like, oh, we're going to tell you're one of them. They were just saying, hey, aren't you one of the disciples? No, not me. The people he's talking to had no authority. He really had no reason to be fearful of them. If he was at risk, he would have gotten arrested along with Jesus. They had them all there. They had Jesus and all the disciples. If they wanted the disciples, they would have arrested them. He had no really reason to be fearful, which is almost always true. We never really have a reason to be fearful. Fear is not a logical, rational, reasonable response. It's an emotional response, a lack of spiritual response. We'll just leave it at that. Lack of trusting the Lord in things. So that's the problem when we respond in fear. The response is not only unbiblical, but unreasonable. So you look at people and you scratch your head and say, I don't understand why they're doing that. It doesn't make sense. I'll be honest, and I know I'm beating a dead horse, but this dead horse just needs to get beaten some more. I really scratch my head why people shut down their church during the pandemic. I cannot fathom it. It is illogical. It makes no sense. It's just to be honest, it's just the most foolish thing I could think a pastor to do. It makes no sense whatsoever, except when you think about fear. Now, we don't know the other disciple that was there. There's no record of him, this other disciple, standing up for Jesus. There's no record of Peter standing up for Jesus. Maybe if Peter had, the other would. Maybe if the other had, Peter would. I don't know, but no one did. So the ones who were the disciples, who supposedly were for him, now we know about Judas. Judas openly betrayed him. But the ones who really said, Peter, I will never deny you. But yet here he is out of fear 3 times claiming not to know who Jesus is. Now, when that happens, when people are unfaithful because of their fear, let me just stop for a moment. How did Jesus treat Peter? He didn't. I mean, he wasn't happy, I'm sure, but after he resurrected, did not Jesus make the effort to get back to Peter? And when people are operating in fear, you can't always be mean and unkind to them. It may not make sense to you. You may say, I cannot understand why they're living that way. But what they need is someone to help encourage them to get back to where they need to be. And sometimes when we look at people's unfaithfulness, sometimes we want to just be mean and hateful and just rail on them. When sometimes what they need is someone to come along and say, hey, you know what, it's really not as bad as you think. Come on, let me help you here. So there are those who are fearful when they need to be strong. That's another group of unfaithful people that we got to be careful of so we don't become unfaithful. 4th group, chapter 18, look with me at verse 28. After this, Jesus knowing, that's chapter 19, sorry. Turn the page when I shouldn't have. Verse 28. Then led they, this is now the Jewish leaders, then led they Jesus from Caiaphas into the hall of judgment. They're going to Pilate. And it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out unto them and said, what accusation bring you against this man? They answered and said unto him, if he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up unto thee. There's a lot going on there. I'm going to give you the point and then try to explain why I'm using this point. Here's number 4. There are those who use religion to justify their carnality. Now this is difficult because they're being unfaithful. You know that. They're living in carnality, but they have all these spiritual phrases they use. And they pull verses out of context and use them. See? Look. Well, yeah, that verse is true, but all these other verses are true as well that you're ignoring that goes with that verse. There are those who use religion to justify their carnality. One of the biggest stumbling blocks to the faith of others are those who use religion as a cloak for their own wickedness or their own unfaithfulness. Now, this is different than Judas, because Judas was with them and then left. These are people who really never were there, and they're causing others now to have problems because of their unfaithfulness. They claim to know Christ, or they claim to be religious, and they use the Bible. You know, a lot of the unsaved liberals who they're for the gay marriage, they're for all the wacko stuff going on out for the mutilation of children, for the idea of transgenderism. They're for all of this wicked stuff. And then they stand up and say, well, that's because, and they'll use a Bible verse. I mean, those are the people I like to strangle at times. It's like, you are absolutely wrong in what you're doing, and you're absolutely wrong in trying to misuse the Bible to justify it. Now, here's what I find interesting about these Jewish people. They are wanting to be clean. So I'm not going to go into this hall where Pilate is, because that would make me unclean, and I can't take of the Passover. So I don't want to defile myself by entering into this hall. But I'll have this guy wrongfully killed to further what my goals are. I have no problem killing this guy, but I'm not going to walk in there where the Roman governor is. You see the problem with that? It's all a facade. Nothing real is going on. They're using religion as a cloak. And that's the problem. So I'll give you this statement. If someone is more concerned with their geographical location, where they're standing at in this room, rather than their spiritual condition, they're probably going to be a stumbling block to others. And if you're going to be faithful and stay faithful, you're going to have to learn to deal with other people's carnality. Some people they know just enough Bible to be a problem. And you can sit there and fuss with them and argue with them, or you can simply say, you know what? I'm going to live for Jesus. Fifth group. Verse 38. So there's more people. Now, and this whole time, Jesus is being faithful, and everyone else is doing all kinds of stuff. Verse 38, Pilate saith unto him, what is truth? Pilate, I'll tell you what truth is. He's right there in front of you. That's what truth is. And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews and said unto them, I find in him no fault at all. Could you imagine going to court and the judge says, son, you're completely innocent of all charges, and I find you guilty. Take him out to prison. You're like, what? Wait a minute. You just said there's no fault in him, Pilate. But yet Pilate is willing to have him crucified nonetheless. And so that brings, and by the way, the reason he's going to crucify Jesus is for his own political ambitions. I have to keep these Jewish people happy, because if I don't, they'll complain to Caesar. And that was the little phrasing where it says, if he's made himself king of the Jews, and if you don't do anything, you're not a friend of Caesar. And there's a little backstory to that and some other things that went on and previous to this with Pilate and the Jewish people. But basically what he's saying is this: Pilate, we're going to complain to Caesar, and you're going to lose your governorship, and or we're going to revolt against you, which anytime people revolted, Caesar was never happy about that, because then he had to send troops and kill a bunch of people, and he really didn't like doing that as much. And so Pilate said, well, if I'm going to keep my power, if I'm going to keep my control, if I'm going to keep this title that I have to go along with it. Very corrupt, very ungodly. So that brings us to number 5. There are those who are corrupt and ungodly. Another group of unfaithful people that you have to deal with. And sometimes when you deal with those corrupt and ungodly people, it moves you from your faithfulness. You're like, well, I just give up. Why even try? Look at the government, look at media, look at Hollywood, look at our society. Why even try to live for Jesus? It's all corrupt. Because Jesus is worthy of it. That's why we live for him. We don't live for Jesus because it's easy. We don't live for Jesus because it's popular. We live for Jesus because he's Jesus and he's worthy of our living for him. So there are those who are corrupt and ungodly. We cannot let the world so poison our souls that we lose our faithfulness to Christ. You know, if you can't watch the media and live for Jesus, quit watching the media. Okay? If you can't be on Facebook and social media and still live for Jesus, get off of it. There's people who they're struggling to live for God because they're letting all of the goofiness of the world get in their head, and they say, well, what about this election? And what about what's happening there? And look what's happening over there. Okay, let me tell you, keep your eyes on the Lord. There is a, if you can stay faithful to the Lord, there are some things maybe you can do in response to them. But let me tell you this, I would rather you be ignorant of all the things in the world if that's what it takes for you to live for Jesus. I don't think that's what it takes, but if that's what it would take, forget about what's happening with the world and all the goofiness. Live for Jesus. So we cannot let this world so poison our souls that we lose our faithfulness to Christ. The world is full of injustice. We're not going to fix that. We can maybe help it be more just, but we're not. As long as men are in charge, there's going to be injustice. There's going to be corruption. There's going to be immorality. Okay, that's. And the media takes a big, like a neutron microscope and zeroes on every little thing they can and makes a big thing about it, and everyone's all worked up about it, because if they can get everyone worked up, they'll keep watching the show, and the advertisers will keep paying them money, and they'll get richer. Okay? The media is not out trying to get you news. The media is out trying to get you to watch them so they make more money. Typically, what the media makes big of is probably not as big unless they, okay, if it's like 9/11 or something like that, obviously that's big. But a lot of things isn't as big as they make it. They getting the liberals all worked up, and then over here they're getting all the conservatives worked up, and everyone's watching either the conservative news or the liberal news. Well, the liberal news or the not-so-liberal news, and they're watching all those things, and they're all getting all worked up, and people are watching. They got their eyes on the TV, and the advertisers are poking out money, and the big talking head people are getting more money in their pockets. And what's happening to you? You're making it all about all these things, and it's poisoning your soul. So what I'm saying is, we cannot let the corruption and the ungodliness of this world so consume us that we get away from our own faithfulness to Christ. We, as believers, must faithfully be salt and light, regardless of how corrupt and dark the world is. That's why we're salt and light. Salt deals with corruption, light deals with darkness. That's why we're salt and light, because the world is corrupt and dark. The Lord knows this. Go with me to Romans. Romans chapter 12. Look at verse 1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. Bill asked me before the service, he's reading the book of Exodus about all these rams and goats and everything being sacrificed. And they're all pointing to Jesus. But there's a sub-lesson, and that is, just like they took that ram and they sacrificed it, took that lamb and sacrificed the goat, that's us. We sacrifice our life. We give our life for the Lord. We just lay it out for the Lord and say, Lord, I'm laying on the altar. You got it all. That's what Paul's talking about. Present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. What's an undercurrent being taught there is, your mind, if it's focused on the world, is going to be conformed to the world. So you got to get your mind off of the world. It's got to be transformed. Well, how it gets transformed? It gets transformed by getting our eyes on the Lord and on His Word. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. That's our faithfulness. I'm not saying, I do not leave tonight saying Pastor White says you cannot watch the news. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if that's going to be your focus and you can't be faithful, then get your focus off of that, because we need to be faithful. So we must faithfully be salt and light, regardless of how corrupt and dark the world becomes. Let me give you the conclusion. So we're talking about being faithful amidst unfaithfulness, because their unfaithfulness, whatever group we're talking about, begins now dinging us, begins hurting us, begins taking away from our faithfulness, which is part of probably Satan's plan. So let me just give you a couple quick thoughts and we'll be done for the night. We need to respond to all 5 of these groups as Jesus did. Well, how did he respond? By staying faithful to God's will. Through it all, Jesus never faltered. Face like a flint, just right at God's will. Not one group took him off the mark. So, what does that mean? Well, that means just like Jesus, we must love them and seek to share the gospel with them. The answer to the world is not to hate them, it's to share the gospel with them. It also means this. That means, just like Jesus, we must stay faithful regardless of their behavior. Well, they won't get saved. Well, you still live for Jesus regardless. So how do we do this? Well, we do it the way Jesus did it. And how did Jesus do it? Through the Holy Spirit which indwells us. You have within you all you need to be faithful to the Lord. You have the Lord. And there's nothing in this world bigger or stronger than Him. So whatever's going on, that's all of a sudden you're, I don't know if I can keep living for the Lord. Yeah, you can, because you have the Lord inside of you. So let me use this. And I hate to say it, but this is just the reality in the world we live. Okay, and I don't really want to talk. Let's say you're in some other church. Okay, and you're in that church, and some spiritual mentor in that church who you have your eyes on commits some horrible moral failure. Terrible. Why does that stop you from living for the Lord? Keep your eyes on the Lord. And keep going, because that's how Jesus, he said, well, I don't know if I could do it. Yeah, you can. You have the Lord inside of you. You have all that you need. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying be glib about it, but the reality is no believer has to be unfaithful, because every believer has the Holy Spirit inside of them, and that is the source of the strength for our faithfulness. It's not just, be faithful. No, it's, I trust Him, and He's going to help me to be faithful. That's being faithful in spite of all the unfaithfulness around us. Let's pray and we'll be done. Father, I pray that you bless us tonight. Help us, Lord. This is the reality.